from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, the verdict is in. Elizabeth Holmes found guilty of fraud and facing up to 20 years in prison. Where the Theranos case goes from here. Plus, despite multiple major companies pulling out of CES, the conference is pushing full steam ahead. We'll sit down with Gary Shapiro, president of the Consumer Technology Association that runs the annual tech show, this hour. And death to the Blackberry. It is the end of an era for the iconic handheld device. Services no longer supported after today. What this means for the company turned meme stock. We'll get to all of that in a moment, but first let's get a look at the markets and a slump in tech shares that dragged down U.S. equities. Our Ed Ludlow here with more. Ed, take it away.
Yeah, so we've heard this story before, right? The outlook for higher interest rates providing a discount to the future profits of the tech sector. And that was really the psychology of investors on Tuesday. The NASDAQ 100, a very tech-heavy index, of course, down 1.4%, most in 2 weeks, after starting slightly higher at the beginning of the session. Also, the NYSE FANG Plus index, a kind of basket of mega-cap tech stocks, falling by the most in 2 weeks. There was some outperformance still down, though, for the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. We had a lot of news out of CES from the chip makers, which we'll come on to later in the show. And ARK Innovation ETF having its worst day in a few weeks, of course, with the sell-off we saw in Tesla shares throughout Tuesday's session. Come me quickly into my Bloomberg terminal and look at this chart. This one's for you, Emily. We are looking for Apple 3 trillion. Isn't that astonishing that we're almost at 3 trillion? We're down by less than half a percentage point all told on Tuesday, but we're flirting with that level, and it's one to watch for in the coming weeks. I can't get my head around it. 3 trillion market cap, up $700 billion over the course of 2021. I'll calm down. We'll talk about that later in the week. Back with me in the studio, cryptocurrency is also a bit in focus. Bitcoin kind of treading water a little bit, trading in a range between $46,000, $48,000, although Goldman Sachs out with some research saying we could see Bitcoin at $100,000 per token as investors move out of gold and there's a broader adoption of digital tokens. So again, one to watch for. Ethereum slightly softer, but overall cryptocurrencies high, as you see on the Bloomberg Galaxy Crypto Index. And finally, Pfizer having a really bad 2 days. Its worst two-day rout since June of 2020. There's a lot of downward pressure at the same time that we know we had news from the company that the US government's agreed to buy 10 million of the Covid-19 pills, boosting its stock of that drug. And if we bring up some of those final moving stocks, some of the stay-at-home stocks also performing particularly badly, the likes of Peloton, the likes of Zoom, down pretty significantly during Tuesday's session, which is interesting given all the bad news we've had in the last 24 hours around Omicron. Emily.
Bad news indeed. All right, Ed Ludlow, thank you. Now, President Biden says long lines for COVID-19 tests fueled by surging cases of the Omicron variant should start to ease as the federal government increases capacity. The president told reporters at the White House today the country has opened new testing sites and that drugstores are restocking home kits.
On testing. I know this remains frustrating. Believe me, it's frustrating to me. But we're making improvements. In the last 2 weeks, we've stood up federal testing sites all over the country. We're adding more each and every day.
The U.S. recorded over 1 million cases Monday, nearly doubling previous records. Hospitalizations are increasing as well, especially among the unvaccinated. Alex Ruoff of Bloomberg Government joining us now to discuss. Alex, Maryland declaring a state of emergency. Are other states going to follow suit?
I think particularly in the Northeast, blue states are definitely looking to respond quickly. These emergency declarations, the big change is they just sort of let states scramble resources. In Maryland, it lets them get the National Guard involved, getting them setting up things. This was really crucial early in 2020 in the mid when, the National Guard, you'd see them everywhere, working test sites, setting up things. It's a real scramble for resources.
Meantime, President Biden now doubling the U.S. order of an antiviral drug. Does that mean more people are going to get treated with it?
Well, that's a good question. I actually wouldn't expect to see it anytime soon. this, this drug is sort of back ordered. I think a lot of the timeline they have and a lot of the pressure from the federal government is to say, you were expecting it September in the fall. We'd love to see this stuff in the summer. I wouldn't, if you're seeking treatment, I doubt you'll run into it at this point. But it really is, it's preparation coming down. And a lot of this is, for the White House to show it's acting. They're really trying to show that they're gearing up, they're preparing. They faced a lot of criticism for not acting fast enough recently. And this is, the White House doing a lot to try to show it's trying to respond to, historic records, historic numbers here.
Meantime, we're all waiting, especially us parents, with kids under 5, for vaccines for younger children to be approved. Moderna now supposedly close to finishing trials for their vaccine for kids under 5. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, they have not released a lot of the data, the information to us at this point. We are a lot of young parents, parents of young children are eagerly kind of awaiting this kind of news. This is a slower process. A lot of the vaccine response has been focused on the elderly, who were understandably the most affected, and the youngest. That's going to take a long time. So it seems to be a while. Again, I think the timeline here has been, Moderna has said maybe March or April. They're hoping to get to the FDA to see it turn around. But part of that again is that young children, they're hospitalized less. They're less likely to die from the virus, and therefore the emergency use and the emergency approvals they're seeking are going to be a lot slower, I think. Or the expectation is that it's going to have less of an emphasis for young children.
All right, Alex Ruoff of Bloomberg Government, thank you for continuing to cover the evolving pandemic for us. Meantime, another top story we are following: Elizabeth Holmes convicted. We're still waiting to find out when she will be sentenced after a jury found her guilty of fraud for her role in the collapse of her once multi-billion-dollar blood testing startup, Theranos. Bloomberg's Joel Rosenblatt, who was in the courtroom every day of the trial, is back with us now in San Francisco. Joel, good to have you back with us. I'd love for you to paint the scene for us as the verdict was being read. What was Elizabeth Holmes' demeanor, and what happened afterwards?
As the verdict was being read, I watched Elizabeth Holmes very closely. And what was very interesting about her was that she comported herself as she has throughout the entire trial. She sat upright. She looked at the court clerk who was reading the verdict, and she stood perfectly still and stared straight ahead. The room was quiet. Her family was still and quiet. There was not really any kind of noise in the courtroom other than the fluttering of keyboards from the press. What was more telling, Emily, was immediately afterwards. I went out into the hallway to wait for Elizabeth Holmes, to try to get a response from her. And as I was waiting, her father was waiting for her, and he found a little nook outside of the room where the defense counsel meets, where he was waiting for her too. And he just, in a suit and tie, sat down on the ground with his knees to his chest, and I kind of peeked at him to see what he was doing, and he was doing nothing but just sitting on the ground, stunned. And to me, that's kind of that image encapsulates kind of the whole trial and the whole story of Elizabeth Holmes finally really falling to earth, and the gravity of what happened kind of taking effect. That's to me the last image that I'll remember from this trial.
Well, and the partial verdict itself sort of says it all in terms of the mixed potential outcomes, right? She was convicted on 4 counts, acquitted on 4 counts, and the jury was hung on 3 counts. Do you think she'll appeal, and how likely is it an appeal would be successful?
She'll certainly appeal. There's no question about that. What's very interesting about the verdict is that mixed verdict shows that the jury took a long time and that they studied it carefully. And you can kind of like read the tea leaves and read between the lines as to what was going on there. I can explain that briefly. In a nutshell, the fraud counts against patients, that she defrauded patients, failed pretty terribly. And most of the investor counts, that she defrauded investors, those stood up very strong. But what it indicates is that the jury really took their time and deliberated carefully and kind of mapped their way through the verdict form and the instructions. And for that reason, Emily, it's going to be, there's no appeal. I think that there's kind of no issue for her on appeal because the jury did such a careful and good job, and the judge also took great pains to allow them to take the time they needed to do it.
She faces a max of 20 years in prison, but as I understand it, she'll likely serve far less than that if indeed she does go to jail. How many years is she likely to serve, and what will her experience in prison be?
Yeah, this requires much more research on my own part, because initially, as I spoke to my sources, it seemed as if she might spend really, ultimately, maybe 3 to 5 years in prison. But as it turns out, we discussed the counts there that she was found guilty of. One of those counts is for a wire fraud in the amount of $100 million. The money matters. How much you defraud somebody of actually matters. So that's a big sum, and under the statutes, that will probably kick up the amount of time that she spends in prison. Again, I need to kind of research this more, but now I think it's more likely that she's going to spend at least 5 years in prison and maybe a bit more. Certainly not 20, no way, no way. But a lot more than I initially expected.
All right, well, Joel, I know it was a long trial to cover for you. You were in that courtroom every day, the very wee hours of the morning, so we appreciate all of your coverage. Thank you for giving us your thoughts in the aftermath. A story now we continue to watch. AT&T and Verizon saying they've agreed to hold the launch of a new 5G service by 2 weeks amidst concerns it could interfere with airplane electronics. The carriers had vowed on Monday to go ahead with the deployment this week. That delay, though, will allow airline and safety officials to take steps to mitigate potential risks. Coming up, CES pushing ahead despite the pandemic. We're going to be joined by Gary Shapiro, president of the Consumer Technology Association that runs the event, to talk about why they're moving forward as multiple major companies cancel plans to attend in person. This is Bloomberg. Events around the world are being canceled amidst Omicron and a COVID surge. But CES, the biggest consumer tech show of the year, is powering ahead, and officially it kicks off Wednesday. This after many companies pulled the plug on their in-person attendance in favor of presenting virtually. Let's talk about what it all means for the event with Gary Shapiro, president of the Consumer Technology Association, which hosts CES every year. Gary, thank you so much for joining us. So look, all of these major companies pulling out in person, other major conferences like the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference being canceled. Why are you moving ahead at this point in the pandemic?
Well, I just want to clarify the facts, and thank you for having me and giving me that opportunity. I mean, the fact is that actually fewer than 10% of our companies have pulled out and at the last minute and made that decision for their own reasons. But we have over 2,300 companies that are exhibiting. And yeah, there is concern, of course, about COVID, but there's also an understanding we are not back in March of 2020. We set the parameters very early in the summer. We're the first major event to do so. We said, look, you have to be vaccinated to come here. We only allow adults in. You must wear a mask. We are giving every attendee free tests so they could have the quick 15-minute test in the privacy of their hotel room. We've taken all sorts of safety measures. And it's something that we are going to have wider aisles. We have social distancing. We're in a brand new facility. The ventilation's improved in all the facilities we're using. This is an environment that we feel is a bit of a bubble, at least on the CES premises. And I want you to compare that to a basketball game or a hockey game or a football game with millions of Americans go to each week, where there's no vaccine requirement, there's no masking requirement, there's none of the social distancing. So I feel much more comfortable at CES right now and being with people here wearing a mask, except for this interview by myself, than I would going to my local grocery store or a sporting event. So I think we're in good shape. Honestly, I think a lot of people have figured that out. We had already a number of events. We had a big one last night with several hundred media and hundreds of exhibitors already showing their products. Everyone was happy to be with each other. The innovation is amazing. We have 2 years of innovation. At least 100 of the companies exhibiting are healthcare exhibitors, focusing on technology. We have the CEO of Abbott speaking as well. And a lot of the companies are actually showing things that deal with COVID itself, how you could get rid of it, how you can sense it. There's like a breathalyzer for COVID. There's all sorts of things that are helping society, but in other areas as well. There's environmental, transportation, robotics, et cetera. There's a lot of different innovations here that people want to see, and they've come from all over the world to do this. They put their life savings, many of these people. This is for the entrepreneurs. It's for the startups. 80% of our companies are smaller companies, and we have many big still in it.
Gary, I mean, people are worried about having a couple of friends over to their house and spreading COVID. Are you at all worried about becoming a super spreader event? I mean, is it ethical at this point to be holding an event this big?
Well, the truth is we've consulted with medical experts, and they've been pretty unanimous saying you're doing everything you could possibly do. A lot of people say, please go forward. I've had entrepreneurs thanking me. People are coming here voluntarily. These are vaccinated people. Vaccinated people statistically show now you're pretty safe. You might get something equivalent less than or equivalent to a cold. That's a possibility. We all recognize that when we go food shopping and we do other things. As I say, there's these sporting events, but people here are focused on innovation and solving the world's problems. We have lots of different companies that are out there, and they're coming and they want to be there. Some of the companies that are talking about on your screen that have nothing to do with us to begin with. There's a lot of factual misinformation floating around. We see a lot of companies that are here, and big companies.
Okay.
Samsung's top executive is giving a speech. They're unleashing products tomorrow. Abbott's CEO is speaking. We have as well, we have some people taking advantage of the opportunity. A lot of the companies you put there are part of the event, and they're participating digitally, so we could extend our footprint around the world as we did in 2021. And I feel really good about the fact that we are going forward, because we have to get back to living again. And we have to do it through leadership, and we have to do it with conviction. We have to understand the risk. We've lived our whole lives knowing that we could get the flu. It's never stopped us from doing anything. And by all accounts, if you are vaccinated, you have no risk at all of getting to this mortal danger that some people have with the flu. It's the non-vaccinated that are the issue, and we and many other events. We're not the event going forward. I want to correct you on it.
Gary, I have to stop you there. Let's leave that to the CDC. Let's talk about CES. Nobody is arguing that the tech trends aren't there, that there is not innovation to showcase. But if you look on, for example, Twitter, people are posting pictures of empty showrooms and hallways. And even as somebody, myself, a journalist who has been to CES in the past, you don't see empty hallways like that the day before the event, even on a press day. At this point, what is the argument? Why go? Why attend this year?
I was just walking down that hallway, and what you're showing is an empty registration area now, because we aren't allowing people to register right now. Those are meeting rooms. The show has not started yet. I think those are very deceptive pictures you're showing. The fact is, if you go to the exhibit floor, if you go to the brand new West Hall, you will see vibrant, new, major and smaller company exhibits. This is what it always looks like right now the day before the show, because you were showing empty hallways in the Venetian Hotel, which I'm in now. So the fact is, yeah, we're going to have a smaller footprint. Yes, we will have fewer people. Yes, there'll even be gaps on the floor from the companies that pulled out. But the fact is, people are choosing to go here because they feel relatively safe. Some people are choosing to go on with their lives, recognizing that there are risks in everything we do, from getting into a car to going to a sporting event, to our kids going to school. And we're choosing to live our lives. And I think that's important. We take some leadership, and that we go forward, and we not spend the next several years in our homes being scared of being alive, because we might get something which it's definitely uncomfortable. It's bad. No one likes to be sick, and it could happen, and it's likely to happen to a lot of people in the next several months. That's the reality. So
all right.
I think it's ethical to go forward with our lives. And I think that to take the position you're taking, I find very unfortunate.
All right, well, we will be covering it, Gary, albeit remotely here on Bloomberg physically. Technology. We'll be watching, and we'll be covering the tech trends of the year. Gary Shapiro, president of the Consumer Technology Association. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time and joining us to share your views. Okay. Coming up this week from CES, Wednesday, we are going to be joined throughout the day by a number of CEOs who are attending. Qualcomm CEO Cristiano Amon, for example. GM's Mary Barra will also be joining us on Bloomberg Television, as well as Palantir COO Shyam Sankar. Some going in person, some not, but lots of great guests. You don't want to miss them. Coming up, with social media companies looking to push even further into the metaverse, we're going to dive into how Snapchat is looking to use that to expand its space. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Snapchat recently released an avatar AR filter that gives you a peek into what you might look like in the metaverse. It comes as more and more companies are looking to take advantage of the growing interest in the metaverse, Snap in particular. Joining us now, Bloomberg Intelligence's Mandeep Singh. So look, how will the promise or potential, Mandeep, of the metaverse impact the growth trajectory of a company like Snap?
Well, so I think what we are seeing now is disruption in the social media space from gaming companies. So typically, gaming companies used to have, about 10 to 15 million user base, and social media companies were much bigger. I mean, for example, Snapchat has 200 million daily active user base. Now, with Roblox getting really a lot of traction, I think what consumers are doing is their engagement times are moving towards more of the gaming platforms. And metaverse is a buzzword. At the end of the day, the biggest use case for metaverse is gaming. And so all these social media incumbents like Snap, like Meta, they're really pivoting to metaverse. Snap more so on the augmented reality side. Meta, we know, Facebook is pivoting more to the virtual reality side. But it will have an impact on their ad pricing, and I think they are going to run against tougher comps. So our view is the growth rates are going to taper for the social media incumbents.
Okay, so who are the biggest threats? What is it, Roblox? I mean, quickly.
Yes, Roblox, Unity is the engine that really is used for designing all these games, and all the design software companies. At the end of the day, there's a lot of innovation around Web 3.0 and 3D software. So a combination of these technologies, and some of these are startups, but you can see how people are thinking about metaverse and how they are building it. So they are the ones who will be disrupting it. Some of the spending is going to go to, the likes of NVIDIA when it comes to building the background infrastructure. But I think it's a full-fledged ecosystem when you think about metaverse as a whole.
All right, Bloomberg's Mandeep Singh will continue to follow your coverage. Thank you for joining us. Coming up, a lesson learned for founders and investors, whether the rise and fall of Elizabeth Holmes will change Silicon Valley or not. We'll talk about that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. After 7 days of deliberation, a jury convicted Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, of defrauding investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. The question is, will this spur investors to scrutinize companies more carefully? Will it deter founders from letting their optimism slip into dishonest exaggeration? In a red-hot startup investing market, is anyone willing to take more time to do due diligence and slow down? Jacqueline Kirtley, professor at Wharton School, joins us now to discuss. Jacqueline, the big question is, will investors, and let's start with investors, will investors actually learn from this? Will they change their behavior?
A lot of the lessons investors have already learned. They learned when this all came out several years ago, and they don't have the burden of proof that a court or a jury has. So they took their cues off of what they learned from the articles, from the stories, from all of that came out a couple of years ago. And in that way, a lot of those lessons have already been learned. That said, lessons learned kind of come and go in this part of the world in investing. So some of those lessons may have already been unlearned by some investors. We have to see how that plays out.
We have a clip from some of the audio recordings played in the trial of Elizabeth Holmes speaking to potential investors. Take a listen to this of Elizabeth Holmes back in 2013.
Several years ago, we realized that we had created an infrastructure that could, in fact, make it possible to get rid of phlebotomy, or the big tubes of blood that are drawn from the arm, in its entirety.
What about founders, Jacqueline, in a Silicon Valley culture that is built on sort of overly optimistic exaggeration? Will this deter them from doing that?
So one of the things about this case that is kind of this horrible example, we talk about fail fast, fail often when it comes to Silicon Valley startups, but that's rarely the story when you come to something as high tech as blood testing. When you mislead or outright lie about the state of your technology, you kind of put yourself at an extraordinary disadvantage because you've lost all the time you needed to do that development because everybody thinks you're already there. So you're starting behind, and that is why even more than the moral and ethical and legal implications of doing this is a really bad tactic for an entrepreneur to take. You've just cut out all the years and all the money and all the research time you needed because you told everybody you're already there. More than anything, that hurts startups. Fail fast, fail often is supposed to be about figuring out what the right thing to do, what the right product is, what the right marketing is, what the right targets are. When it comes to hard tech, lying and faking it till you make it actually hurts you in the development process, even more than, in some ways, even more than the ethical questions about whether or not you should lie and whether it's dangerous, which in this case, we're certainly getting into.
You teach the Theranos case in your tech entrepreneurship class, and what is your main message to your students? What is your main takeaway?
Time is extraordinarily precious to entrepreneurs. Half the time you're trying to get money to buy time, to do the work. So with hard tech or life sciences, biotech, you want all the time you can have. Tell the truth. And you can be optimistic without lying. You can say we will without saying we already have. And that's the biggest message that I give my students. Once you cross the line of saying we already have, you lose that time. Until you can be optimistic, you can be positive, you can be gung-ho, you can convince people that you're doing the right thing and that you're gonna get there without crossing the line into claiming you haven't done things. The fact is, we all want what Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos were selling. We would have bought into that if the message was we are, we will. The lie didn't have to be there, certainly not as early as it was. I think the video you just showed was 2013. The lie didn't need to be there to get the funding to sell that story. That's the biggest message that I talk to my students about. You can sell the pitch, you can talk about what you're going to do, and you can be incredibly optimistic without crossing the line of fraud or lies that can cost you as much in your development process.
I'd agree the lie maybe didn't need to be there to get the attention of reporters either. Much of the trial actually focused on a Fortune cover story that was written by journalist Roger Parloff and hours of recorded conversations between Elizabeth Holmes and Parloff himself. Many journalists, including myself, interviewed Elizabeth Holmes, and we didn't ask tough enough questions. How much responsibility does the media bear here? And will the media, quote unquote, learn from this?
It's funny you say that. I actually use a video of an interview that she did with a different Forbes reporter in my class and ask my students, what is she doing right? Partially to get them to think about all the things she did right as an entrepreneur. She convinced people of her message of the potential, both market and life, and for people, for the human and social mission. I don't think we should ever let go of that. And I don't think the media should let go of that. But what we need to do is make sure we're doing the due diligence. The trial has definitely highlighted how much we don't dig down and that we need to dig down more. And that's the piece that I think maybe the lesson for some of the rest of us, whether I hope the investors learned, but we'll see, that we need to dig down to more.
How big is the risk that this could negatively impact not founders, but female founders in particular, in an industry where women are already way too underrepresented among entrepreneurs?
I was a little frightened as I saw the trial unfold, supposedly what they call it, the Svengali defense, that I think could have damaged not just female founders, but female founders with mixed gender teams, because it implied that the male on a team would have power over a female founder. I think in many ways since that's sort of been undercut, and the implications of everything I've seen from the verdict is that the jury didn't see that as what was going on. Hopefully that won't impact female founders as much. And what it means is that all founders, female included, all founders need to demonstrate what they're doing and show that they can answer the questions, that they have done the work, and that they can stand behind what they're doing and move forward. I don't think, since that part of the defense has sort of fallen away in the outcome, I think that will have less impact, specifically on female entrepreneurs.
All right. Wharton professor Jacqueline Critley, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. Appreciate it. Another story we continue to watch about another controversial founder, Adam Newman, who built office co-working giant WeWork, less of a giant now, has a new business venture as an apartment landlord. Entities tied to Newman have been acquiring majority stakes in more than 4,000 apartments in several cities, valued at more than $1 billion. This according to court, property, and corporate records and people familiar with these transactions. Newman is said to have told friends and associates he wants to shake up the rental housing industry. Coming up, the chip shortage dragging on. We're going to talk about what is next for the semiconductor industry as delivery times get longer and longer, and what we can expect, when we can expect bottlenecks to ease. This is Bloomberg.
Now, one of the things that jumped out at us was this need for a better, more unified cross-device experience. I'm pleased to announce that we've acquired Screenovate, a pioneer and leader in delivering technology for advanced interaction between multiple devices based on different operating environments.
Ryzen 6000 powered notebooks feature our fastest Ryzen processor ever. With boost speeds up to 5 gigahertz, we're delivering an average of 1.3x faster performance compared to the 5000 series across a wide range of compute-intensive benchmarks.
The rapid expansion of 5G offers the potential for low-latency cloud gaming everywhere. So we've teamed with AT&T and their fast, reliable 5G network to bring the power of PC gaming to mobile devices.
Sticking with semiconductors, 2021 was a year of bottlenecks and soaring lead times for chip makers. Let's bring in Ed Ludlow to give us an outlook on all of this and where we're headed in 2022. Ed, take it away.
Well, I'm sorry to say, we're headed in the wrong direction. We got the latest data from Susquehanna Financial on Tuesday, and lead times are stretching, right? We're up to almost 26 weeks, and the lead time, of course, being the point that an order for a semiconductor is made and the point that a customer actually delivers it. And if you look at the Susquehanna data, it's broad-based across all types of processors. So there are the supply chain constraints. They're going in the wrong direction. They're not necessarily improving. That was the month of December. But 2021 was a good year for semiconductor companies, right? Revenue's really strong. 2022 is set to be a $500 billion year for this industry for the first time. And what's so interesting, this IDC data behind me, is that annual revenue growth for semiconductors is set to continue. In fact, we could see 3 consecutive years of revenue growth, annual revenue growth, for the first time in decades. This data for IDC going through to 2025. Of course, this is an industry that's typically been boom and bust. And we know that when we've seen extended lead times in the past, we've seen a lot of over-ordering, which has led to gluts. It'll be interesting maybe to ask your next guest if that will be the case this time around. That's on the chip maker side. The end user kind of tells a different story, especially the automotive industry. We've got fourth quarter sales from the American autos on Tuesday, and actually many of them painted a much more positive picture for 2022. Some select ones I picked out. Hyundai say we've hit the bottom in terms of that trough that they've experienced with limited inventory because of a shortage of semiconductors. GM saying that looking into 2022, they're actually optimistic that the semiconductor picture is improving. And finally, Toyota, they basically put it pretty simply. Our inventory continues to improve in large part because semiconductors are starting to cycle through. So it continues to be one to watch. It's been a whole year of telling this story, Emily, and I'm going to tell you all about it for a year to come.
All right, Ed, thank you. Long year ahead. So when is the chip shortage going to end, and what is the future of the chip industry? To talk about that and more, I'm joined by Renee James, Ampere computing chair and CEO and former president of Intel. Renee, good to have you back with us. So let's give us a status of the state. Where are we right now in the chip crisis? How bad is it, and when does it ease up?
I wish I had all those answers, Emily. I think we are at the point where, as Ed just pointed out, lead times are long. There's different reasons in different sectors why those lead times are longer than we would like to see. But I think people have orders now starting to come in. And so over the last second half of last year, a lot of long lead time orders were placed by customers in different segments. So inventories are starting to come in. And so from a consumer perspective, you'll start to see improvement, even though those lead times are still longer than we want. I think in some sectors, we already are seeing the second half of 22 will begin some easing as capacity comes online. It just really depends on if you're on the leading edge of semis and high performance, or if you're in you know, kind of more of the mainstream, how long that's going to take to work its way through. But the good news is we're growing.
What about the potential for supply, oversupply, gluts, as Ed mentioned? Do you see that happening?
You know, Ed is right. It has historically been a cyclical business that has had that possibility. I think this time is a little bit different than what I've seen in the last couple of decades in this business, where we have multiple growth segments happening at the same time. Ordinarily, we would see PCs growing, or we would see cloud data center growing. We might see automotive or embedded growing. Now we're seeing every segment. So when we see that, we know that what we're seeing is sustained growth, we're seeing expansion. So I am less concerned about overcapacity on this cycle than I have been before. Lots of us follow capacity planning. We see future starts. We see how much capacity different companies are putting in as they announce their capital expenditures each year. And I myself have not concluded. I'm not an economist like you have there at Bloomberg, but I don't see that this time. I see multi-segment growth, demand for multiple nodes, not just leading edge, but some of the older nodes, and growth in those areas. And I think that's an important factor this time around.
CES is going ahead with in-person plans, despite major companies like Intel, where you worked for many years, pulling out. What do you think about that?
You know, I think it's a personal choice if people want to go. And I know a lot of our industry has been at work from home for a long time, and we're excited about that. I myself, you know, would not advocate it, but I guess it's a personal choice for those that want to attend in person. That's a hard decision.
Well, even before the pandemic, there was some skepticism about how relevant CES still is. And I'm so curious, given your long history in this industry, does the Consumer Electronics Show still matter when companies can go direct to their audience, go direct to the press so much more easily these days?
You know, that's a great question. I think the one thing that the Consumer Electronics Show has done is it's focused a bunch of different, you know, what used to be discrete different consumer electronics that are now all connected in some way. I mean, you used to think of the television as very separate from the computer. You don't so much anymore. I think it is an opportunity for everyone to convene at a certain time with new information and to give consumers and people inside the industry a kind of a vision of how this all comes together. Does it need to be in person? I don't know. Can it be done direct to consumer? Absolutely. And we saw a lot of those press conferences that were virtual today. But I do think that the timing of it and having it be an annual thing and the convening of all those announcements is still very helpful to organize the information. It is hard to wade through how much comes out once a year about all these new appliances.
All right, point taken. Now, last quick question. What is the future of Ampere in 2022? What is your role in the return of the chip industry going to be?
Well, I'm glad you asked. You know, you heard a lot today in all of those CES announcements about ubiquitous connected computing and devices. And PCs still grow, and Qualcomm had a tour de force announcement today. Yeah, and what we do is we build cloud chips, and what we do even more specifically is power efficient, high performance microprocessors for the cloud and the edge. So I'm very encouraged. I enjoyed listening to the visions from the client side, if you will, because all of that leads to more demand in the data center. The pervasive use of AI in cars and in software across different services and different applications demands even more compute in the cloud. So from our perspective, we're super excited about it. We had a great year in 21. We're looking forward to 22. We have more new things coming out. So it's going to be an exciting year for us.
All right, we'll be watching. Renee James, Ampere Computing Chair and CEO and former president of Intel. Good to have you back with us. Coming up, just 10 years ago, this was one of the biggest phones on the market, and now the device can't even make a phone call. More on Blackberry ending service on its legacy devices next. This is Bloomberg. The James Webb Space Telescope team has fully deployed its protective sun shield, a key milestone in preparing it for science operations. The sun shield is about the size of a tennis court at full size and will protect the telescope from the light and heat of the sun, earth, and moon. The telescope has another 5.5 months of setup still to come. After that, Webb will deliver its first images exploring every phase of cosmic history. And it is the end of an era, literally. This Tuesday, Blackberry officially ended service on its once iconic phones, meaning if you have one at the bottom of a drawer and you turn it on, it won't work at all. Bloomberg's Mark Gurman joins me now with more. Mark, I remember the days of the Crackberry and how important it was to me. How many people are still actually using them?
Oh, I would say in terms of these legacy Blackberries, this would be, if you remember, the Blackberry Curve, the Blackberry Pearl, the Blackberry Bold. Those are the latest range of the most popular ones, the Blackberry Storm, their touchscreen version. I would say in terms of active use, it has to be in the single-digit thousands, right? Double-digit thousands at most, if not just in the hundreds, right? Because the functionality on these things has been dwindling for years. Carrier support has been gone. Real support from BlackBerry as a company has been gone. So many people have transitioned to Android devices and iPhones and other types of phones across the world. So I would say it's a very slim number of people being impacted here. And one more thing I'll add, they warned about this about 6 years ago, that this would happen. So people have had a lot of time to prepare.
I know there are folks out there using BlackBerry Android devices still. Will those be affected by this?
Yeah, so Emily, there's a slew of devices from small manufacturing partners, names of companies that people really haven't heard before. There's a company called TCL, which has made phones. They're leveraging the BlackBerry brand. Even though BlackBerry as a company is completely pivoted and it's a really old school brand, it's still very popular with some people, right? I don't think that's a name that anyone who's ever lived in the technology industry or knows popular culture will ever forget, right? So they've been leveraging that name for devices with full touchscreens, with keyboards that look like Blackberries, but BlackBerry really has nothing to do with them other than the brand and some retail channels. And those, like you said, do run Google's Android operating system, and those are not impacted. The impacted devices are the real, like you said, old school Blackberries running version 10, so BlackBerry 10 software, BlackBerry 7 software, and this BlackBerry Playbook tablet that launched many, many years ago in the early days of the iPad, running Playbook OS 2.1 or earlier.
So quickly, 20 seconds to go. BlackBerry, the company today, it more recently was a meme stock. What do they actually do? 20 seconds.
Well, they've completely refocused to cybersecurity technology, protecting devices. They work with governments and companies really as a security system. And their current CEO, John Chen, really transformed the company in their post-mobile era.
All right, Mark Gurman, the death of the Crackberry. Thank you. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Make sure you tune in tomorrow. We'll be joined by Palantir COO Shyam Shankar, Activate Consulting CEO Michael Wolf, and SoftBank's Stacey Brown, Phil Pott, as well as Shu Nayada. Great show. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.